From our State House studio in Montgomery, I'm Todd Stacy. Welcome to Capitol Journal. This week, we got an update on the situation with Alabama's prisons, including what progress is being made to build 2 new state-of-the-art men's prisons. It happened at a meeting of the Joint Legislative Prison Oversight Committee here at the State House. Department of Corrections Commissioner John Hamm told lawmakers that the estimated costs for the prison construction project have increased drastically. The Elmore project alone is now projected to cost $973 million. That's up from the original estimate of $623 million when the legislature passed the plan back in 2021. And with inflation and the rising cost of materials, that price tag could exceed $1 billion in the end. The committee's meeting was a long one, more than 2 hours, but we learned a lot about the issues the Department of Corrections is facing and its plan for addressing them. Capitol Journal's Randy Scott was there and takes us deeper into the story.
Lawmakers forming the State Joint Prison Oversight Committee returned to Montgomery to discuss the status of Alabama's Department of Corrections and several key issues facing it, including construction timetables.
Elmore Specialized Men's Facility, some of the activity go on because we're still getting chatter that nothing is happening at the construction site, and that is very far from the truth. You know, we've already installed a lot of the all of the stormwater pipe and sanitary sewer, done some chase mock-ups, the precast sail mock-ups.
A wide range of topics are up for discussion, including equal contract bidding, cost, and staffing.
I was out there yesterday, and I'm still not totally happy with the minority participation piece, because there is a piece in the legislation that specifically lays out a program for minority participation. And but we did have a real frank and honest conversation about it yesterday.
But I think we're doing a good job on setting a precedent and a template for other departments and agencies to use on the minority business enterprise on any future construction or capital outlay projects. The last amendment by CFO was $973 million.
So are we anticipating it being more than that when we meet again?
It could be more than that. But we're close. We'll know Tuesday at 2 o'clock.
So it'd be fair to say it's probably going to be north of $1 billion.
This site is 300 acres inside the fence, and it will have 50-plus buildings on it, from walking in the front gate to the back building, we're housing inmates. It's going to be about a quarter of a mile. We're going to have 4,000 inmates in this facility.
Looks like for this quarter, from the numbers that I can see, you gained 1 officer in the month of May. You gained 5 officers in the month of June, and you gained 33 officers in the month of July. So you gained 1 officer between March 31st and April 30th. You gained 5 officers between April 30th and May 31st, and you gained 33 officers between May 31st and June 30th.
Because if I told you that, at some point, if I explained to the public that at some points in some facilities you may have 750 inmates and 4 guards, that paints a picture. That makes you understand we gotta hire more people.
For Capitol Journal, I'm Randy Scott.
Governor Kay Ivey this week continued promoting her Turnaround Schools initiative. She began the effort last year as a tool to transform low-performing schools and their surrounding communities. Educators from those turnaround schools gathered in Prattville this week for a special academy hosted by the Office of School Improvement. Ivey, a former teacher herself, encouraged the attendees to work as a team to lift up these schools and their communities.
We should always remember, strong students result in a strong state. Now, being in a room full of educators, it's safe to say everyone here can appreciate a good acronym. The one I'd like to refer to often is TEAM, Together, each accomplishes more. My Turnaround School initiative is targeted and collaborative in approach. And I stand here today to tell you just how confident I am that we will be successful when we work together as a team.
The governor also bragged on the early success that some turnaround schools are already seeing, which had the teachers from those areas excited.
As this school year kicked off, my first stops were to ABC Elementary and J.E. Hobbs in my home county of Wilcox, and they have seen the highest percent increase in third grade reading scores out of any district in the state. Just this week, I visited a couple of our turnaround schools in Birmingham. Both Brown and Hemp Hill Elementary schools have seen a significant increase in math proficiency. Not far from here in our capital city, Dozier Elementary now has what is called a STEAM, S-T-E-A-M lab, with a full-time teacher that serves all students in the school. We're seeing more of a focus on the arts. We're seeing strong partnerships with the Department of Mental Health and DHR. We're seeing greater parent engagement. And all of this is made possible by our Turnaround School initiative, and I sure am proud of that.
Turning now to Washington, where Congress has yet to reach an agreement on funding the government with just a week left until the new fiscal year begins. Should they not pass at least a stopgap spending bill by September 30th, the government will run out of money and many agencies will shut down. While most of the gridlock is in the House, U.S. Senator Katie Britt this week signed on to legislation that would prevent future government shutdowns. The bill would trigger an automatic 14-day continuing resolution, keeping funding at current levels should Congress not pass appropriations bills on time. Britt said, quote, "The American people are tired of seeing critical government services being held hostage while Congress irresponsibly pushes to pass massive spending bills at the last minute." She continued, "Taxpayers shouldn't be forced to keep paying the price for this budgetary political brinkmanship," end quote. U.S. Senator Tommy Tuberville claimed victory this week as the Senate moved forward with confirming 3 top military leaders: General C.Q. Brown as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Randy George as Army Chief of Staff, and General Eric Smith as Commandant of the Marine Corps. Tuberville has been blocking the Senate from conferring group military promotions as a protest of the Pentagon's new policy to pay for travel expenses for out-of-state abortions. He has argued that the Senate could move forward with these individual promotions, but that his hold on group promotions will continue until the Pentagon changes its policy back.
There's around 300 of them, but most of them are lower level generals and admirals. But we got some at the top that are the main leaders, such as the Commandant of the Marines. So today, hopefully, we show him how you do it, how you can get it done, how even people on his side of the aisle want to get things done, especially the upper level generals and admirals. So this Commandant, as we've said earlier, has already taken his job. He's running it every day. We want to get this done, again, to get the Commandant process through the right situation, and also show Chuck Schumer that we want to get on with this. And if they want to do all 300 at one time, let's just change this policy back and let's have a vote on the floor, and we could remedy it in a very short period of time. But Chuck Schumer, he doesn't want to do. He wants to use it and hold it as his political advantage.
When we come back, I'll sit down with Mental Health Commissioner Kim Boswell to discuss Suicide Prevention Month. Later in the show, I'll be joined from Washington by Stephen Boyd to get his take on what we can expect next in the budget showdown. And finally, we'll preview the upcoming Pat Dye documentary with the film's director, Slats Slaton. We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capital Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capital Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capital Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capital Journal podcasts.
September is Suicide Prevention Month. Joining me next to talk about it is Kim Boswell, Commissioner of the Alabama Department of Mental Health. Commissioner, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Todd. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you on to address this very serious topic. Talk about Suicide Prevention Month and what this means in terms of raising awareness about this issue.
So it's a wonderful opportunity for us to really make the community aware of suicide prevention and just a lot of facts around suicide and some of the reasons, some of the risk factors, some of the signs and symptoms. This year we really kicked off suicide awareness with work with our veterans organization, the Department of Veterans Affairs. Mm-hmm. In Alabama, we have one of the highest rates of suicide among veterans. And so that is a real issue in our state. And so we've been partnering with the Department of Veterans Affairs to really address some of the issues specifically related to veteran suicide. Mm-hmm. So that was quite a good event. And then we have several other events across the days that we're working on suicide prevention. And there are many activities that are all designed to increase awareness of suicide and the risk factors and how to talk to someone who may be considering suicide or in a suicidal crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember talking to Kent Davis about that. I guess we were kind of previewing the event as it was coming up, and we had a couple of them, and really some interesting work going on there. And I imagine it's the PTSD, a lot of that, from veterans. When it comes to suicide, it has been such a taboo subject. I just remember growing up, you didn't talk about it, right? But that seems to maybe have changed a little bit with more awareness. And isn't that important just to be able to talk openly about it in order to prevent tragic situations?
It is, and I think one of the major misconceptions people have is that if you ask someone or you talk to someone about suicide, that's going to increase their risk, and it really doesn't. One of the most important things you can do is talk to individuals, ask them how they're feeling, ask them if they're thinking about suicide. That's really important because oftentimes people will tell you, if you actually ask them, they will tell you how they're feeling and what they're thinking about. But you're right, for a long time it had a huge stigma attached to it. And it also creates, if someone has a family member who dies by suicide, oftentimes, people don't want to talk about that. It's a very mysterious thing, how their loved one died. And so we really have tried to encourage people to talk about it, to talk to someone if they think they're at risk, to talk to families who've experienced that, because it is very isolating to family members. I think you heard one of the members of the legislature this past year talk about her experience with her husband. Mm-hmm. And their family had some experiences of their own with their daughter. And then the next thing her husband is also in a situation where he did wind up having a suicidal crisis. And talking to family members and being open about that is huge, because isolation and disconnectedness are really very detrimental to people. Mm-hmm. And so the more that you can talk about it, the better. Once a family member has a situation, a suicidal crisis, and then it's oftentimes other family members do unfortunately begin to consider that, because loss of a loved one once again puts them at risk of a suicidal crisis as well. So it's really, really important for people to talk about it. You're not going to increase someone's risk of suicide if you talk about it or you ask them how they're feeling. So we really do want people to talk about it.
We talk about isolation and maybe losing a loved one. That makes me think of young people, kids,
Yes.
and just the prevalence there is for anxiety, increased anxiety, depression, maybe even really brought on in part by the social media and just the prevalence of it and the different pressures that come in with high school. Talk about the suicide risk amongst youth.
We have a huge concern about youth mental health, particularly coming out of COVID. We have seen dramatic increases in anxiety, depression, suicidal crisis with kids, and it's a combination. It really is a very complex set of reasons as to why a young person in particular might consider that. But needless to say, social media is not helping us at all. Often kids get really focused on information that they're seeing through social media, and they begin to think that, everybody looks this way or acts this way, and I need to look and act this way. It's really just very detrimental to the overall mental health of kids to be really, really focused on social media. It also contributes to isolation and disconnectedness with their actual peers. Instead of going to somebody's house, you're on social media, but you're not really making that real connection if you're actually spending time with others. And before you know it, they can really be in a situation that they really didn't even anticipate. They're isolated, they're experiencing signs and symptoms of depression. They have no idea what that is, or that everybody else in the world is not feeling the same way. And so if they're not talking to their peers, if they're not talking to their parents, that can become a very detrimental situation for kids.
Are there resources for parents to maybe understand how to better talk to their children if they see some of those warning signs?
There are a ton of resources out there. Obviously, part of what we do, as you know, is school-based mental health. So we put a lot of resources in the school systems. You also have State Department of Ed who has put mental health service coordinators in school systems. Every school system has a significant amount of funding dedicated to at-risk kids who may be at risk of mental health issues or a suicidal crisis. I was very pleased to see Dr. Mackey talk recently about doubling the amount of money they're putting into mental health service coordinators. So I think that's going to be a big part of his request during the budget process this year. And so really getting those folks in the school systems that can identify those issues and talk to parents is really huge for us in Alabama. And then there are a lot of other ways that parents can get engaged as well. There's a lot of really good information out there. You can go to our website at mh.alabama.gov. We have a lot of resources. But I really think it's all about relationships. And I think having that mental health service coordinator and that mental health therapist in a school really is about identifying those kids, finding those kids that seem to be disconnected.
Because they're trained to.
They are, and they can recognize those kids that really are struggling. That's really one of the big advantages to having those mental health professionals in the school system. There are a lot of things that can help kids if kids are really engaged in sports. We know that building resiliency and wellness is really important to offsetting some of the mental health issues. So getting kids really engaged in sports or in church activities or anything that really gets them connected in a positive way to their peers and to their family is really the best thing you can do to help prevent these kinds of issues.
It's great advice. Let's talk about 988.
Yeah.
This is really, I guess over the last couple of years, has been a huge initiative, not just here in Alabama, but nationally.
Right.
I know that there are efforts to expand the 988 services. Talk about 988, what it is, and where it is available in Alabama.
So 988 is the new 3-digit number. It really started out as a 10-digit number for the National Suicide Hotline, and that number, that 10-digit number, converted to 988 nationally. And then, of course, that happened on July 16th, 2022. And just in Alabama, in 1 year, as of August, we've received, just in Alabama, over 52,000 calls.
And these are crisis situations, whether it's me personally or I have a loved one or something, right?
Right. It's anyone who's in crisis. We know that 23% of those calls came from veterans. So we really see 988 as helping save lives. 988 right now is available statewide. We don't really have the full capacity that we need for 988. We are currently funding 988 through grant dollars. And so, of course, we are looking to figure out a way to sustain 988 over time. We looked at the call rates today, and 68% of our calls are staying in-state. The rest of those calls are rolling out of state because we don't really have the capacity we need right now. Our goal is to get to 90% in-state answer rate. It's really, really much better if we can answer calls in-state and not have the calls roll to the national number.
Sure. Well, I know that there was the effort in the legislature last year to have that fee, added onto a phone bill, where just like a 911 fee, right? We all pay that with our cell phone bills. This would be an additional fee for that crisis hotline services. It got some traction in the legislature, but ultimately didn't make it. It was a pretty busy session. Do you see that bill coming back or something like it when the legislature meets in February?
We're going to have those conversations. We've been honestly having those conversations since the session ended. We have a meeting of our legislative stakeholder work group that's led by Representative Reynolds. We'll be meeting on September 28th, and that is on the agenda to talk about and to consider, should we go ahead and drop a bill next year? If we do, should it be at the same amount that we had in the legislation last year? That's one of the things that's on the table. I think, do we ask for 98 cents? Do we ask for something less? And there have been some good conversations with telecom over the summer to really try and address some of the concerns that they raised during the session. And really trying to focus the revenue from that primarily on mobile crisis teams and the 988 call centers. So if you think about 911, which is funded in a similar way, our sort of comparable to a 911 call center is a 988 call center, and the comparable component to EMS is a mobile crisis team. And so it makes a lot of sense, we think, to fund those services through that fee that would be generated.
Yeah. Well, speaking of crisis centers, is there an update? I mean, I keep losing count. And that's good news. Obviously, the legislature is funded, and y'all have really sprung up these crisis centers throughout the state. Where are we number-wise? And I know you were kind of attacking regions, but every region getting a crisis center.
So the good news is on October 17th, we'll be opening a crisis center in Tuscaloosa. And that is, let's see, our 5th crisis center.
Okay.
I lose count sometimes too, Todd. That's our 5th crisis center. We have a crisis center in Huntsville, Montgomery, Birmingham, and Mobile. And so Indian Rivers and Tuscaloosa is going to do their grand opening October 17th, which we're really, really excited about. And then we do anticipate SpectraCare in Dothan coming on this year as well. So that'll be our 5th crisis center that we have opened. The really unbelievable number that I talk a lot about, if you look at the last 18 months of operation of our crisis centers, over 800 people showed up at a crisis center who were suicidal. And so that's 800 people that we intervened, that we stopped. It's lives we're saving.
Yeah, save lives.
Yeah. So it's working. When we started crisis care, we felt like it was the right thing to do. We followed some of the national trends, but we really have the data to prove that crisis services 24/7, that it really saves lives. Unfortunately, we don't have those services in all 67 counties.
While I've got you, we're short on time, but I wanted to ask you about the opioid commission. I know there's a meeting coming up, and this commission is dealing with how to spend the money that we've gotten in these settlements, right?
Right.
Talk about what the decisions are going to be like for the commission.
So we've sort of been tasked as a department to create a competitive grant process for distribution of the settlement funds. And so part of what we'll be doing at the meeting is really laying out a set of principles that we think are really important when considering how to spend the settlement dollars. For example, first principle is first save lives, because obviously there are a lot of people who are still overdosing from opioid use disorder. And so we really feel like it's important to make sure that those dollars are going to increase the services that are available to people with opioid use disorder. A lot of that work and a lot of the principles and a lot of things we'll be talking about really comes out of the governor's opioid council that we really ran for 5 years. And so we really feel like we're in a good position to support that commission and provide them with the information they need to be able to make good decisions.
That's next week, and we will be there.
All right, great.
Well, thanks again, Commissioner, for coming
Sure.
on, and thank you for your work in awareness of suicide prevention.
Thank you, Todd.
We'll be right back.
The Alabama Department of Archives and History was founded in 1901, becoming the nation's first publicly funded independent state archives agency. The archives identifies, preserves, and makes accessible records and artifacts of enduring historical value to the state. Thomas Owen founded the agency and served as its first director. He was succeeded by his wife, Marie Bankhead Owen, who headed the archives for 35 years and was the second woman to lead a state agency.
You're watching Alabama Public Television.
The United States government is on the brink of a shutdown, as Congress has yet to reach an agreement on spending levels as the end of the fiscal year approaches. Joining me next to talk about it is Stephen Boyd, a veteran of Capitol Hill and a partner at Horizons Global Solutions. Stephen, thanks for coming on Capitol Journal.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Well, we've got a lot to talk about in terms of what's going on in Washington, but I wanted to introduce you a little better. Those who have worked in politics in Alabama and Capitol Hill know you very well, of course. But for the rest of our audience, I should explain that you've been on the Hill, worked on the Hill for 20 years or more, worked as a communications director, a chief of staff for both Alabama House members and senators. You worked at the Department of Justice as the Assistant Attorney General of the United States, and now are a partner at Horizons Global Solutions. So given all that experience on Capitol Hill, I know you've seen many budget battles, but I'm curious, does this one look different to you? Does it feel different to you in terms of the dividing lines and where people are?
Yeah, we've been through this a few times now since I've been around. And look, there's nothing new about Congress waiting to the last second to take action. Unfortunately, that happens far too often. But yes, this is different. The dynamics are a little bit tougher this time around. Usually when you get in these crisis situations, you have some reasonable path to how you're going to get out of it. And at this point, with just a few days remaining, I don't really see what that path is. And I think a lot of people in Washington agree with that assessment. Speaker McCarthy, as you know, only has a 4-seat margin of error in his very narrow Republican majority. And he's got 5 to 10 folks on the right who essentially are just obstructing and blocking his progress on passing the spending bills or a stopgap measure that would keep the government open and buy Congress a little more time to act.
Well, yeah, I guess that was the latest, is they were going to put up the defense appropriations bill, which usually has a lot of support to pass, but couldn't even pass the rule, and that was a huge surprise. And I guess the speaker sent everybody home. Was that a surprise to everybody in Washington? I guess leading up to that, people thought maybe there could be a path forward, but that kind of broke down.
Yeah, it was a surprise. The defense spending bill is usually one of the less controversial spending measures. There are 12, as you know, and under the regular order, which frankly rarely ever happens, the House would pass 12, the Senate would pass 12, and they would merge at the end and then go to the White House for signature. Currently, the House has passed 1, the Senate has passed none. So there's a long way to go with just a few days. The defense spending bill, to your point, has typically been something that would pass without too much fanfare. It's very important, funds military operations and Department of Defense operations, pays our troops, that sort of thing. But yes, the last few days have been a bit shocking in the fact that the procedural motion to move to even considering that, to debate on it and to have votes was blocked. And, without getting too far in the weeds, these procedural votes are typically almost pro forma party line votes. If you're in the majority, you vote yes, and in the minority, you vote no. And then you get to the measure on the floor and you have the substantive debate. So essentially, this small group of Republicans is taking the view that the House should not even move to debate that bill until they are promised or pledge some path forward on their demands.
Well, yeah, and as you mentioned, we've been here before, and I remember 2013, that government shutdown over defunding Obamacare. Remember, that was sort of the big deal. But even back then, you had a much larger majority of House Republicans. I forget what the number was, but at least 235, maybe more than that. So they had the numbers. But even then, as that government shutdown went on, I think it was 13 days, something like that. Ultimately, those conservatives that were holding out didn't get what they wanted. So I'm curious, why not learn the lessons from that? Because at the end of the day, does this small block of those on the right, do they stand to gain anything?
Well, it's divided government. The Senate is run by Democrats. Democrats own the White House right now. The House is run by the majorities of the Republican Party, but the narrow margin really limits what can be achieved. And I think many members are very honest about that with their constituencies and say, we have to try to make incremental gains where we can, but be realistic and keep fighting for the things we believe in. Others take an approach where, if we can't have dramatic change or get exactly what we want, we're going to hold up everything. And you've got a situation now where the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, has referred to some folks in his own party as just wanting to, quote, burn the whole place down, which is a really remarkable statement, and I think illustrates where we are.
Well, as you mentioned, we've only got a handful of working days left until the end of the fiscal year, until the government shuts down. Do you see a path forward, or how likely is it that we can avoid a shutdown, or is it inevitable?
I suppose nothing is inevitable in politics. You never know what's around the next corner, but any sort of objective assessment at this situation, at this point, you'd have to say it's more likely than not that there will be a shutdown. The deadline is this coming Saturday. The House is supposed to return on Tuesday. That leaves a very short window to accomplish a lot. They're going to move forward with voting on some individual bills, which is, or at least to try to. They haven't been able to do that, obviously, but that's a little puzzling because there's no way those bills are going to pass and become law by this weekend. So they probably will be forced to consider a continuing resolution, which is a stopgap, temporary measure that keeps funding at the status quo levels, generally speaking, and allows a little more time, whether it's 2 weeks or 30 days or 60 days, for Congress to act.
Let's say that there is a government shutdown. We hear that term a lot, but can you describe what actually happens when the government shuts down? How is daily life different for Americans, and would we even really know what's going on?
For your average, just typical American walking around, probably not in the first few days. If it's a short shutdown, 3, 4, 5 days, 7 days, probably not a huge day-to-day impact. In 2018, the shutdown was, I believe, 35 days. And by that point, you certainly see implications of the federal government not being able to function in a way that it should. You see that in terms of Social Security benefits, possibly VA benefits, law enforcement, military defense issues to some degree, although many of our men and women in uniform will be deemed essential to national security purposes and therefore go to work without pay during that period. Another thing I think is not discussed enough about government shutdowns is the signal it sends to our friends and allies around the world, particularly our security partners in Five Eyes and And that sort of security partner, when they pick up the paper and they see the United States government has shut down and is not operating at its full capacity, that sends a bad signal to our friends and allies, and it sends a very bad signal to our enemies and potential enemies.
Well, how does this end? I mean, let's play the tape through to the end. It seems like, Speaker McCarthy, like the math is not going to change in terms of that. If that handful of those on the hard right are not, they don't seem like they're going to move, and so you can't pass a bill. Does he have to then lean on Democrats? And if so, doesn't he risk losing the gavel, right, being removed as Speaker? So how does he navigate that? And we haven't really talked about the Senate. How can they be involved in an ultimate solution?
Yeah, McCarthy has to deal with the political world as it is, not as he perhaps wishes it were. And that very narrow margin really limits what he's able to accomplish right now. I think a likely outcome, or at least a possible outcome, would be the Senate to take a House-passed bill. These measures have to start in the House. So they would take something that's already passed the House, strike out all the substance of that bill, put in a continuing resolution that would continue government funding, keep it clean of any of the controversial amendments that the House Republicans have sought, some of them, and probably put in money for Ukraine, which is not a popular point in the House at this point, in the Republican side, and then send that over to the House. And then McCarthy has an option. And that option is either to ignore it and try to pass his own, which doesn't seem likely, and therefore risk a government shutdown, or bring it up and with a coalition, bipartisan coalition, pass the CR, keep the government open. That would almost certainly inflame the 5 to 10 members of his caucus that are already his critics, and they would probably, in fact, most likely, move to try to take him down, remove him from the speakership. You might remember back when he was seeking the speakership in January, but one of the concessions that McCarthy had to make was to change the rules to allow a single member to move to change the speaker. And that was a decision that he made then so he could get the votes to become speaker, fine. But he may now regret that decision here in the next few weeks.
Yeah, and how many rounds was it? Like 15 rounds of voting or something that it took for him to become speaker. And of course, that was one of many concessions he had to make. But I guess what's curious about that is, let's say that does happen. Who else could be speaker? I mean, the math is not going to change.
Well, yeah, I think that's a very important question that a lot of people don't get to, which is, if not McCarthy, then who? The provocateurs on the right certainly don't have the votes to be speaker. It seems unlikely in this political environment that a moderate Republican would be the speaker. And so if they do move to vacate the chair, as it's called, which is essentially to remove McCarthy, the conference will have to ask, okay, then what? And I think that question will really be a factor on members' minds if we get to that point.
Well, switching gears a little bit, let's talk about the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. This is the annual bill that Congress passes. I think it's gone more than 60 years in a row with passing it without fail, usually a bipartisan thing too. But we're getting late into the year and it hasn't passed yet. The last time I talked with Congressman Rogers, who's the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, he seemed pretty frustrated. What's the latest on NDAA?
Well, Chairman Rogers has done a fantastic job as the new chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, which basically oversees policy and programs at the Department of Defense. It's very, very important. He's really risen to the occasion as chairman, and he's gotten a lot of praise here in Washington for how he's managed the committee and moved them through this process. The bill he produced out of his committee is a very, very good bill. Later, it was added to, in the sense that certain controversial social amendments were added, which really, in the traditional bipartisan spirit of NDAA, has not been something that has been very typical over the years. This is in contrast to the Senate bill, which is more of a traditional NDAA bill. They both passed the chambers. They're in a conference process right now that has just begun. A lot of that work is done at the staff level. They'll save the 3, 4, 5, 6% of the big issues for the members to hash out. I think what we will see is by the end of the year, the NDAA will pass. And when it does, I think it's going to look a lot more like Chairman Ryder's original bill and the bill that he wants, as opposed to how it got changed through the process. So that would be a good thing for the committee. It'd be a good thing for the Congress to get that done. And frankly, that bill has a ton of things in it for Alabama and Alabama's defense industry and our military footprint in the state. So maybe that's a conversation for another day, but that's certainly something to watch.
Absolutely. Well, I've got to ask you, because of all your experience in Washington, D.C., and especially on Capitol Hill, how does this rank? I mean, are we right up there in terms of the most, gridlocked you've ever seen? Where does it compare to other fights?
Yeah, right now I think that's probably the case. It's really changed a lot over 20 years. In the spirit of cooperation, just trying to get certain things done, has really diminished, in my opinion. There are a lot of really good people who serve in Congress. Some of them I consider to be good friends. Certainly the Alabama delegation stands out as a great group of folks who work together to get things done for the state. And I think anybody with interest in the state should be proud of that. But the political environment as a whole is tough. The country is divided on a lot of issues. Congress is essentially a mirror of the country. And that plays out pretty much every day. And if you look at the just general output of the Congress in terms of the basics, mechanics of government, it's not a particularly optimistic view you have. And then that doesn't even speak to larger issues like, for example, reauthorizing a 5-year farm bill, which is extremely important, but also politically and substantively and from a policy perspective, complicated. So we're not even talking about those things. We're talking about the basics, and right now that seems pretty hard to accomplish.
It's a great point. Input matters as to output. Well, Stephen, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will look forward to hearing your weekly updates or reading your weekly updates that you publish, the Monday Brief in Alabama Daily News. Those are a popular item. But thanks again for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks, Todd.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org. Click on the Online Video tab on the main page. You can also connect with Capitol Journal and link to past episodes on Capitol Journal's Facebook page.
This coming Monday, Alabama Public Television will air a new documentary on the life and legacy of former Auburn football coach Pat Dye. The film is called Mighty, and joining me to talk about it is the director of the film, Slats Slaton. Slats, thanks for coming on Capitol Journal.
Appreciate you having me.
Well, talk to me about this project, Mighty, on Pat Dye, how it came about and when you got involved.
Well, when Coach Dye passed away, he and Jimmy Rain were dear friends, and Jimmy called me and said he wanted to meet and put together a documentary on his life. And so when I sat down and we talked about it, I actually thought he just sort of meant, okay, we'll get some game footage, we'll get some stills, we'll write a little narration, and that'll be done in about 3 months. And he said, no. He says, I'd like you to interview some people. And anyway, he gave me
the real deal.
Yeah, the real deal. So anyway, he gave me a list of about, at that time it was 20. The list ultimately grew to be like 35 interviews.
Wow.
But he gave me a list of like 20 people, and there were some pretty big hitters on that list.
Yeah.
And when I got back to the office, I looked at that, and Bo Jackson, Brett Favre, and I called back to their office, to Jimmy's office, and I said, it was just a phone number. I said, so when I call this number, am I going to get an agent, or how does this work? They said, I don't know. These are just the numbers that Jimmy uses. And I said, okay. So the day came where I got to schedule, and top of the list was Bo Jackson. So I just sort of took a deep breath and dialed that number, and anyway, a scary thing happened when I called Bo Jackson. I tell people he answered the phone. So, but
what do you do?
Yeah, and anyway, he couldn't have been nicer, and that process got easier and easier. But yeah, needless to say, we met a lot of great people, and it was a 2-year journey. And anyway, we're real proud of the result.
I talked to Jimmy Rain a few weeks ago. We had him on Capitol Journal during our trip down to BCA. And he talked a little bit about the film, and he said something that stuck with me. He said, few people have had a bigger impact or done more, I think he said, done more for Auburn than Pat Dye, which I think is really interesting because he wasn't just talking about football. He was talking about an entire, a range of contributions to that school. Did you hear a lot of that from the folks that you interviewed?
Absolutely. As far as football goes, and that, prior to Pat Dye's arrival, there was just, sort of tough times.
Oh, yeah.
They had this losing streak, and I tell people, when Auburn needed a Pat Dye, and when he came along, he turned the program around, and he just energized, the student body, and needless to say, with the stadium later on,
Sure.
I mean, he had
it's a different place than it was.
Absolutely.
Well, as you mentioned, you interviewed a lot of famous and interesting people. So I was curious if anything stood out in terms of maybe a story that you weren't expecting or were surprised by.
Well, it's interesting. You start this process, and you think you know the story. His football career, and I did my research, and but what happens is you start interviewing people, and they'll say, well, have you talked to so and so? And you're like, no, who is that? Or, well, you need to talk to them. And then you talk to them, and then you realize, you learn a little piece of say, Coach Dye's life that you didn't know about. And so there were constant turns like that. And I remember I was talking to Jane Snell, who is Coach Dye's sister, and she said, have you talked to Fran? I said, Fran? She said, Fran Tarkenton. I said, no. She said, you need to talk to Fran Tarkenton. They were roommates at Georgia.
That was his Georgia team.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Oh, and a duo back in the 50s. And so, of course, we lined that up. And anyway, there were constant just twists and turns, and just learned so much more about the man than what I knew early on.
Oh, I can imagine. We're going to show a clip here in a second. You can get a feel for just how many people, and that's just a little taste. But it was something I was curious about. I'm an Auburn grad, fan all my life, grew up idolizing Pat Dye. So, of course, I'm going to enjoy this film. But I'm curious what you think about others, maybe even Alabama fans. Is there something for them to also enjoy and appreciate about this film?
The secret is I graduated from the University of Alabama.
There you go. Okay.
but absolutely. Needless to say, there's an automatic tie with Georgia and Auburn. But Pat Dye spent 9 years at the University of Alabama coaching under Coach Bryant.
Yeah.
And was a real good recruiter. And anyway, and I think, you have your hardcore Alabama fans, but I think they all respect Pat Dye.
Yeah, I agree. And there are so many stories of them too. Those two being friends, even as they were coaching against each other, and when Pat Dye came to Auburn. So I think there's a mutual respect there that comes along with it. Are there any other fun stories you can share about this project? Maybe some of the interviews you had and what you learned.
One interesting thing is, this is hard to believe, and especially to say in Alabama, but I'm not a huge football fan. I went to Alabama, and I was there in late 70s and 80s, and I enjoyed going to games, but I don't live and breathe football the way a lot of people do. And I tell people, I grew up in the country with 4 sisters, so football's not my first language. but I just learned so much. And the people, his family, I mentioned Jane Snell and his son Pat Jr. and Wanda Dye, his daughter, and Nancy McDonald, his partner. And oh goodness, people say what was the best interview? They were all tremendous. And like I said, a lot of big names. Nancy was really one of my favorites. She could tell a story, and she had so many on him. And anyway, she's featured quite a lot in the film.
Well, maybe that's a part of what makes you perfect for the role, for this directing role, is having that. If you're not, living and breathing it every moment, you have that maybe a fresher perspective than a lot of us would have, who are just so biased, and everything.
Yeah, I think that probably did help me. And when every interview, Norton Dill was the cinematographer on this, and there was a lot of people I worked with, Joe Bryan and Brian Collins. They were editors, so it's a real collaboration. Not to mention Jimmy, he was involved too.
Mm-hmm. We do have a clip, so let's go right to that and show. This is Mighty. A film by Slats Slaton, and on Alabama Public Television on Monday night.
I was born and raised on a farm. It's in a small country town.
Daddy was a cotton farmer mainly. From the time the boys got big enough to work, he worked them on the farm.
There was no slack given anywhere, anytime, none.
The way he had to grow up, he had to be tough. He wouldn't have lived through what he did if he hadn't been tough.
When you're the third son, you don't win at anything. You finish second or last at everything. I didn't like finishing last, and I didn't like finishing second. And losing made me tougher.
The main cabin where we would all sit and eat and listen to his stories, right behind him, there was a pitcher. I mean, this guy looked like a heavyweight boxer. And I said, "Coach, who's that in that picture?" He turned and looked, and "Oh, hell, this is me." And we said, "What happened to you?" He said, "Hell, I got old."
The two greatest football players I've ever played with, this will shock you, was Pat Dye and Mike Ditka.
In 1959, 1960, my dad always would tell me, "Now, Billy, I want you to watch Pat Dye. Billy, I want you to watch number 60. He wanted me to experience firsthand what effort and attitude, the difference that made in someone's outcome and talent and possibility.
I am very excited about being at Auburn. It is what I consider one of the top jobs in the South, and I'm confident that with the support of the Auburn people, alumni, the former players, the student body, the faculty, the administration, that we will be able to bring this great football tradition back to what it once was.
He immediately set the tone and said, "No, we're going to be different." And he meant it, and you knew he meant it because when that reporter asked him that in that very first press conference, "Coach, how long is it going to take you to beat Alabama?" He never hesitated. He didn't blink. He said, 60 minutes.
He was out there morning and night, and he wanted to win, and he wanted to get the right kind of players, and he did.
He didn't sugarcoat anything. If you violated his rules, if you broke his rules, he's going to introduce you to the dog. And a lot of people said, "What's the dog?" The dog is a Greyhound bus at the Opelika bus station.
Coach Dye was a hard-nosed SOB, to be honest with you, when you're talking about being a football coach.
That was Pat Dye's coaching style. If you made it through the week, Saturday's going to be downhill.
You know, he had a presence about him that I think a lot of the great coaches from the past had, that, you know, you can't really explain, but you really know when you see it.
I think to call Pat Dye the Bear Bryant of Auburn really is not fair to Pat Dye because he was so unique. In those early years, I don't think there was a better coach in this country than Pat Dye.
He's a sculptor. I mean, he would tell me, "I want to put a pond here and tree here and, you know, rocks here." And he had an imagination and a creativity.
Little by little, he would plant maples here. He would add some more to the water feature. It was amazing.
The person of a man may go, but the best part of him stays. It stays forever. As long as they play football here at Jordan Hare Stadium on Pat Dye Field, as long as that Auburn sunset is orange and blue on a football Saturday, Pat Dye's spirit and his contribution to this place will remain, and it will remain strong. The years may come, the years may go, but his influence will remain.
One of my friends told me once, he said, "He's just a big teddy bear." I said, "There's a grizzly in there too."
All right, that looks great. I'm getting chills here, and just in time for Auburn, Georgia week.
That's right. Well, anyway, we're real proud of the film, and anyway, just hope everybody enjoys it, Auburn and Alabama.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thanks for coming on the show and talking about it. Look forward. And again, that's Monday night at 8 o'clock here on Alabama Public Television. Slats, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be right back.
Birmingham, Alabama native Fannie Flagg, who is best known for her novel Fried Green Tomatoes, had a long career as an actress and comedian before dedicating herself to writing. Published in 1987, Fried Green Tomatoes, a story of racial and gender inequalities told through the unlikely but strong bonds of its female characters, resonated with audiences. The novel stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for 36 weeks and was adapted into a critically acclaimed movie.
That's our show for this week. Thanks for watching. We'll be back next week with more Capital Journal at the same time right here on Alabama Public Television. For our Capital Journal team, I'm Todd Stacy. We'll see you next time.